Hey friends, I'm Joy Chu, a former scientist turned content creator, and the goal of my YouTube channel is to help people discover the joy of cooking with science. For this week's video, I'm making one of my absolute favorite pasta sauces, Genovese-style basil pesto. I've been whipping up pesto in my food processor for as long as I've made it at home. But lately I've gotten more curious about other ways people make it. If you've watched Kenji Lopez-Alt's cooking show on YouTube, for example, you'll notice that he uses a mortar and pestle, which is the traditional Italian method. Many others have sung the praises of pesto made with a mortar and pestle, but I wanted to taste it for myself. So today, I'm going to make and compare 3 different versions of pesto. 2 with a food processor and 1 with a mortar and pestle. And if you stick around, you'll get to see my husband and me do a blind test. Quite literally a blind test because I'll be tasting blindfolded. My recipe is inspired by Bon Appetit, Food 52, and Kenji's cooking show. And per usual, you can get the full version with notes by subscribing to my free Substack newsletter. But just a heads up, for today's video, I'm going to make half batches of everything because, well, once we get to the mortar and pestle, you'll understand. Now let's get to the pesto. The very first thing I like to do is to toast the pine nuts. To do that, I'm going to lay out 3/4 of a cup on a parchment-lined baking sheet and toast them briefly in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit until golden brown. This is completely optional, but I find that toasting them adds more nutty flavor. For the first food processor version, I'm going to blitz 1 garlic clove, a 1/4 cup of toasted pine nuts, 2 cups of fresh basil leaves, and a 1/4 teaspoon of coarse salt together in the machine. Then I'm adding about a 1/3 cup of grated Parmesan and drizzling in a 1/6 cup of olive oil at the end. I'm blitzing this one more time until we get something like this. The second food processor batch involves blanched basil leaves. Have you noticed that your pesto sometimes turns this darker, kind of murky looking color? That happens because of something called oxidation. Cutting, processing, or bruising the leaves activates enzymes that turn them brown. So some people blanch them to stop those enzymes from working. But the downside of blanching is that it potentially removes some of basil's characteristic herbal, fresh flavor. To test how much it impacts flavor, I'm blanching 1/3 of the leaves very briefly and immediately plunging them in ice to stop the cooking process. Then I'll process the pesto the same way I did for the first batch, except with blanched and raw leaves together. You'll notice that the color is clearly brighter, but we'll have to wait until the blind test to taste it. At this point, you might be thinking that pesto made with a food processor looks pretty good, so why even bother working so hard with a mortar and pestle? I like Kenji's analogy of why a mortar and pestle makes a more flavorful pesto than a food processor, so I'll explain it briefly here. A basil leaf is made of stacks of cells that contain all the flavor. So you can think of a leaf kind of like this stack of sponges. A food processor will basically slice through this stack without really disrupting any of the cells. But a mortar and pestle will extract more flavor because you're basically pressing the stack and squeezing everything out. Make sense? So to show you a mortar and pestle in action, I'm using this Italian marble mortar with the lobes, which mark the traditional Genovese style, and this pestle made with olive wood. There are many different kinds of mortars and pestles that you can use to make pesto, but I decided to get this one because it's well designed to make creamy, emulsified mixtures. For this version of pesto, I'm first going to crush the garlic until it turns into a paste. Then I'll add the pine nuts and mash them until they turn into a paste as well. Now it's time for the basil leaves, with some coarse salt to act as an extra abrasive. If you have fresh basil leaves straight from a plant, they probably won't be as tough to grind because they have a lot of water content and less cell wall fiber. For those of us who don't grow our own basil, I find that chopping the leaves into smaller pieces first makes the job a lot easier and keeps your pesto from getting too stringy. In any case, it's best to break down the leaves in batches and definitely be prepared for a good arm workout. For the last few steps, I'll add and fold the cheese in, drizzle olive oil in batches, and mix until the pesto comes together. Now that we've worked through a variety of ways to make pesto, it's time for the blind test. Here's how it's going to work. The ingredients are all exactly the same among the 3 versions, so the only major difference we have to consider is the method. I'll try each version one at a time while blindfolded, so I don't know which version I'm tasting. After I taste each one, I'll give my completely honest, unscripted opinions on screen. And at the end, I'll assess flavor and texture based on a simple 1 to 5 point scale, add the points, and tell you which one scored the highest. All right, this is the blind test now. So full disclosure, I do not know what I look like, but I'm wearing an eye mask and a very cute purple scarf. So hopefully at least I don't look completely stupid. At least hopefully I look cute. Okay, so this is sample A. Hopefully facing the bowl in the right direction. Now I'm going to attempt to put the spoon in my mouth. I'm going to talk about the flavor first. So the flavor is pretty good. It's like, there's like a little bit of garlic that comes out. It's mostly creamy tasting. Nothing that stands out too much except the garlic. And then in terms of the texture, it's like kind of chunky. It's creamy, but it's like, it also has like little bits of like pine nuts. So I don't know, I guess for flavor, I would give it like a 3, and texture, I give it a 4. It's like a nice creamy texture. Okay, so this is sample number 2. Whoa. In terms of flavor, this one definitely, like everything's just amplified. Like the garlic is just like really strong. I have to taste it again to... Yeah, you can just taste like the garlic and the cheese. It's very obvious. And then the texture is like, it's like really creamy. Like even more creamy than before. Really smooth. But there's like little stringy bits that I think are from the basil leaves. Yeah, I think for flavor it's like 4.5. Like everything's just like really strong. And then texture, creamy parts are 5. And then the stringy parts are like, they're okay. I think I would prefer a little bit less like leafy texture. So I guess I would say texture maybe like 4.5. So 4.5 for flavor, 4.5 for texture. So this is the last one. This is kind of similar to the first one. Flavor is like kind of mellow. You can't taste as much of the garlic, but you can taste the cheese. For texture, it's like, it's not as chunky as the first one. Tastes a little bit smoother, but it's not as creamy and smooth as the second one. The flavor is probably better than the first one, so I'd give it like a 4. Texture is okay. I feel like it's a little bit, almost like sandy. I guess I'd give it like a 3.5 or 4. So now that I'm done with the tasting, I thought just for funsies to make a prediction while blindfolded before I go into all the numbers and see which sample was which. So I'm gonna say sample A was the blanched pesto, and then sample B was definitely mortar and pestle, and then C I think was regular food processor pesto but not blanched. All right, let's see what we have for each sample. So this is sample A. It got 7 points, and for each of these bowls we put little post-it notes to tell us which one was which. So I'm gonna pull this post-it note off, and it was the blanched version. All right, so we have sample B, which got 9 points. Let's see what this one was. Mortar and pestle. So last but not least, we have sample C, which got 7 3/4 points. And I think we all know by process of elimination, it was the classic food processor pesto. So now that we have our data, I wanted to take a moment to talk about some takeaways from the results that we got. So it's interesting that even without looking at the samples, you could definitely taste differences among the three versions. And even within the two food processor versions, you can still taste a little bit of a difference, with the blanched being a little bit less flavorful than the regular. And of course, you know, if we're talking about the winner in terms of flavor and texture, mortar and pestle wins. I know that the food processor is definitely easier and more convenient, but I would definitely recommend investing in a mortar and pestle if you want to make good pesto. So I know the main part of the video is the blind test, but in my book, you can't have a pesto video without pasta. So I went and made myself way more pasta than I should have, but nothing fancy, just spaghetti boiled in water and salt. And after mixing the pesto, I grated some Parmesan and then sprinkled some leftover toasted pine nuts. So without further ado, I'm going to taste this, and bon appetit. This is so good. And the timing works out too, because this is right around dinner time. So this is going to be what I'm going to be eating pretty soon. Thanks for watching. To get the full recipe with notes, subscribe to my free Substack newsletter. For all of my fellow pesto aficionados, leave a comment if you've tried any of the methods I've shared today, or if you prefer a different one. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep learning more about the science of everyday cooking, like and subscribe to my channel below. Definitely make some pesto this weekend, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
So long.